The candle had burned low by the time anyone noticed that something was terribly wrong. It was deep winter, the kind that settles into old stone houses like a second tenant, pressing cold fingers into every crack and corridor. The estate of Ashwood Manor stood silent beneath a moonless sky, its tall chimneys breathing pale smoke into the dark. Inside, the servants had long retired to their quarters, the fires banked, the great halls hushed. But in the narrow room at the eastern end of the servants' wing, a young woman named Elspeth could not sleep. She sat upright in her cot, her thin arms wrapped around her knees, eyes wide and fixed on something that was not there. Her lips moved without sound. Her breathing came in long, hollow pulls, as though drawing air from somewhere very far away. The other women in the room noticed nothing at first, they were too deep in the mercy of sleep. But one, an older laundress named Marta, stirred when the cold crept too close. She opened one eye and saw Elspeth sitting there in the dark, trembling like a candle flame in a draught. "Girl," Marta whispered sharply. "Lie down. Morning comes early." Elspeth did not answer. She did not even turn her head. And that small, weightless moment of non-response, was the beginning of everything. To understand what happened to Elspeth, one must first understand the world into which she had been born. The year was 1847. England's great estates were kingdoms unto themselves, each ruled with quiet but absolute authority by families whose names had been carved into their counties for generations. Ashwood Manor, set in the rolling hills of the North Yorkshire countryside, belonged to one such family, the Hartwell household, presided over by the widowed Sir Edmund Hartwell, a man of measured temperament and old-fashioned convictions. He believed in order. He believed in propriety. He believed, above all things, that every person in his household had a place, and that the world functioned best when no one strayed from it. Within this hierarchy, Elspeth occupied a modest but essential position. She was a housemaid, not the first, not the last in the rank of domestic service, but diligent and capable beyond what her 22 years might suggest. She had come to Ashwood Manor at the age of 13, taken on as a scullery girl after the death of her father, a tenant farmer who had left behind nothing but a name and 3 children with empty hands. Her mother had wept when she left. Elspeth had not. She was, by all accounts, a quiet young woman, industrious, careful with her words, unfailingly punctual. The other servants respected her without exactly warming to her. She kept something inside herself that was never quite unlocked. She rose before dawn, dressed the fires, turned out the grates, aired the drawing rooms, polished the brass until it threw back light like a looking glass. She was proud of her work, in the way only those who have little else to be proud of can understand. She had no family nearby. No suitor. No great ambitions, or none that she spoke of. What she had was routine, and a set of keys to every room in the house. If stories like this intrigue you, stay a little longer. For what followed was unlike anything that the household of Ashwood had ever witnessed. The morning after Marta found her sitting in the dark, Elspeth appeared at her duties as usual. She dressed the breakfast-room fire. She laid the table. She carried coal scuttles up 3 flights of stairs without complaint. Anyone watching her that morning might have concluded that nothing at all was wrong. But Marta watched. And Marta was not satisfied. She ate nothing, the laundress told the cook that evening, in the low, serious tones reserved for matters of genuine concern. Not a bite. I saw her at table, she just sat and looked at her bowl as though she'd forgotten what it was for. The cook, a stout Derbyshire woman named Mrs. Potton, wiped her hands on her apron and frowned. She'll eat when she's hungry enough. But Elspeth did not eat. Not that day, and not the next. By the end of the first week, the changes had grown too plain to dismiss. She moved through her duties as before, but with a strange, drifting quality, as though she were performing them from a great distance inside herself. Her eyes, once sharp and attentive, had taken on a clouded look, like pond water disturbed from below. She would stop in the middle of a corridor and stand very still, her hand resting on the wallpaper, her head slightly inclined, as though listening to something that no one else could hear. The other servants began to whisper. Not cruelly, not at first, but with the low, uneasy murmur of people confronted by something they cannot name. 3 weeks into Elspeth's strange decline, the household had drawn its quiet battle lines. Mrs. Potton maintained that the girl was simply overwrought, exhausted by too much work and too little rest, a condition she claimed to have suffered herself in her youth and recovered from with broth and sleep. The head housekeeper, Mrs. Aldgate, who ran the servant quarters with military precision and very little sentiment, believed it was a deliberate performance, a subtle kind of insubordination, perhaps, or a bid for sympathy and lighter duties. She had seen it before, she said, in her previous position in a house in Leeds. The younger servants were not so certain. There was the matter of the mirror in the west corridor. Elspeth had always polished it as part of her weekly duties, a great, dark-framed glass that had hung there since before anyone could remember. One morning, the third housemaid, a girl of barely 17 named Lily, came upon Elspeth standing before it, not polishing, but simply staring into her own reflection with an expression that Lily could never quite bring herself to describe in full. Only to say that it was not the face of someone recognizing themselves. There was also the matter of the sounds. 2 of the male servants, groundsmen who slept in the far wing, reported hearing something in the nights that followed. A low, rhythmic sound, like a person reciting words in a language they did not know. They never found its source. And then, one morning, Elspeth collapsed. She was carrying a tray of silver candlesticks to the dining room when her legs simply gave way beneath her. The silver scattered across the floor with a sound like small bells. When they lifted her, she was conscious but rigid, her jaw clenched, her hands curved like claws. It took 3 people to carry her to her room, and all 3 spoke of it in hushed tones for weeks afterward. What truly caused such a condition remains one of the deepest questions of this story, but what unfolded next changed everything. Sir Edmund Hartwell was not a man given to dramatics. But the collapse of a servant in his dining room, followed by the report of Mrs. Aldgate that the girl had been declining in a most peculiar fashion for nearly a month, was enough to bring him to the door of the servants' wing, an area of the house he had not entered in years. He stood at the foot of Elspeth's cot and looked down at her with the careful expression of a man trying to measure something he has no instrument for. She was pale as chalk. The hollows beneath her eyes had deepened into shadows. Her hands, resting atop the blanket, were still. "Has a physician been sent for?" he asked. Mrs. Aldgate replied that she had not thought it necessary. Sir Edmund sent for one immediately. Dr. Fawcett arrived from the market town 2 days later, a lean, precise man with spectacles and a leather bag that smelled of camphor. He examined Elspeth for nearly an hour while the household waited in various states of anxiety below. When he descended, his face offered no reassurance. Nervous exhaustion, he pronounced with the confident vagueness that distinguished a certain type of physician. He prescribed rest, iron tonic, and fresh air. He said nothing else. He left. But one person in the household was not satisfied with Dr. Fawcett's verdict. That person was Thomas, the head footman, a man who had known Elspeth since they had both arrived at Ashwood within the same fortnight, nearly a decade ago. He had noticed something the doctor had not thought to ask about. Something that had been pressing on him since the night of the collapse. 3 months earlier, Elspeth had been summoned privately by Mrs. Aldgate. Thomas did not know what passed between them in that closed room, but he had seen Elspeth emerge from it with a face he had never seen on her before, something between terror and grief, so quickly mastered that most would have missed it entirely. He had not missed it. Stay with us, for what Thomas uncovered would reach far deeper than any illness of the body. What he eventually pieced together, in fragments, through careful questions and long silences, painted a picture far more human, and far more devastating, than any supernatural explanation could have offered. Elspeth had, in secret, over the course of 2 years, been setting aside a small portion of her wages. Not for herself, for her younger brother, William, who had fallen gravely ill and whose care required money that their family did not possess. She had been sending what little she could spare through a letter carrier who came through the village. But 3 months ago, Mrs. Aldgate had discovered the arrangement, not through any great investigation, but by accident, when she intercepted a letter at the household post. The problem, in Mrs. Aldgate's judgment, was not the charity. It was the deception. The use of the household's letter carrier for personal correspondence, without permission, a violation of the domestic code, she had informed Elspeth, that could be grounds for dismissal. She had not dismissed her. But she had made something very clear, that Elspeth's position at Ashwood depended on her continued absolute compliance with every rule and expectation. That any further deviation, any further evidence of a life outside these walls, would bring the matter before Sir Edmund himself. What Mrs. Aldgate had not considered, and perhaps could not have, was the weight of what she had placed on a young woman who had already been carrying more than anyone knew. Elspeth had received, 1 week after that conversation, word that her brother had died. She had told no one. She had gone to her duties the following morning. She had polished the silver and laid the fires and aired the drawing rooms. And then, slowly, over the weeks that followed, something inside her had begun to go very quiet, as a fire does when it is given no air, not extinguished but gradually, silently smothered. When Thomas brought what he knew to Sir Edmund, carefully, respectfully, at great personal risk, the household changed in ways that were small but not insignificant. Mrs. Aldgate was not dismissed. Such things were rarely so clean. But her authority over the servant quarters was quietly redistributed. Sir Edmund, for his part, said very little. He was not a man accustomed to examining the interior lives of those who served him, and this knowledge, that suffering of such depth had moved, unseen, through his own household, sat uneasily in him for a long time afterward. Elspeth was given leave, real leave, not the grudging kind, to return for a time to what remained of her family. She was told her position would be held. Whether she chose to return was left entirely to her. She did return, in the end. She was never quite the same. There are griefs that do not fully release their hold, that settle instead into the architecture of a person and become part of the way they stand and speak and move through a room. But she was present again. The clouded look left her eyes. She ate. She slept. She resumed her keys, her fires, her corridors. She never spoke of William to any of them. But on the first anniversary of his death, Lily the housemaid found a small clutch of winter flowers laid on the windowsill at the end of the east corridor, placed with such quiet care that they might have been an altar. No one asked. No one moved them. They remained there until the petals fell, one by one, onto the cold stone floor. What haunts this story is not the mystery of the body, but the silence of the heart. In the great houses of that era, illness among servants was frequently attributed to weakness of constitution, lack of moral fortitude, or simple malady, catalogued, dismissed, or feared as something beyond understanding. Rarely was it asked, what has this person been asked to carry? Rarely was there space, within the rigid architecture of service and duty, for grief to exist openly, for loss to be named and mourned and given the dignity it deserved. Elspeth's condition had no supernatural cause. No dark curse, no miasma, no failing of the spirit. It had, instead, the most ordinary and devastating source imaginable, a young woman, alone in a house full of people, who had lost the last person she loved and had no